I want to start by telling you something I've had to accept slowly, painfully over the past year. Something that still costs me a certain amount of pride to say out loud even now. I fell in love, genuinely and completely, with a woman who was quietly working, from very early in our marriage, to separate me from my own children, so that everything my first wife and I built together over 4 decades could eventually belong entirely to her instead. My name is Frank Delaney. I'm 72 years old, and I spent 46 years building Delaney hardware from a single storefront my father helped me open in 1978 into a chain of 3 locations across the Cleveland suburbs, the kind of steady, unglamorous success that comes from showing up every single day and treating customers like actual people rather than transactions. I sold day-to-day management to my son, Mark, 5 years ago, though I still own the underlying real estate and hold a controlling financial interest in the business itself, a decision that seemed, at the time, like exactly the responsible, forward-thinking arrangement any father would want to make for his family's future. My first wife, Ruth, and I were married 40 years before ALS took her from me. A slow, devastating decline that lasted nearly 3 years, and I won't dwell on the details of that loss here, except to say that watching the woman you love lose control of her own body, piece by piece, teaches you things about grief and patience that nothing else quite manages to teach a man. Ruth worked alongside me at the original hardware store for most of our marriage, handling the books and the ordering, while I managed the floor and the customers. And I've often thought, in the years since her passing, that her particular sharp instincts about people, knowing immediately who could be trusted with credit and who couldn't, might have spared me some of the slower, more painful realizations I eventually had to reach entirely on my own. I have 2 children. My son, Mark, is 46 and manages our flagship hardware store location, a genuinely skilled businessman who's grown the operation considerably since taking over daily management from me, expanding our inventory systems, and modernizing our approach to supplier relationships in ways that honestly exceeded what I'd managed to accomplish during my own decades running things. My daughter Susan is 43, a middle school teacher with 2 kids of her own, steady and thoughtful, in a way that reminds me constantly of her mother, the kind of person who reads a room carefully before speaking, but says exactly what needs saying once she's decided to speak at all. The 3 years following Ruth's death were among the loneliest of my life, and I want to be honest about that loneliness, because I think it matters to understanding everything that happened next. I kept myself busy at the stores, far more than a man who'd technically already begun handing over daily management should have needed to. Mostly, I think now, because the alternative, returning to an empty house that still held every trace of Ruth's presence, felt considerably harder to face than an extra few hours restocking shelves that Mark's staff could easily have handled without me. 4 years after Ruth passed, at a grief support group I'd started attending somewhat reluctantly, at Susan's urging, I met a woman named Vivian Cross, 58, herself recently widowed, according to what she told me. Charming and vivacious in a way that felt, after 3 years of profound loneliness, like sunlight returning to a room that had been dark for far too long. Vivian had a particular gift for making a person feel like the most interesting individual in any room, asking genuine-seeming questions about the hardware business, about Ruth, about my children, listening with an attentiveness that I hadn't experienced from anyone since Ruth's illness had first begun consuming most of our shared conversations years earlier. We married 14 months after meeting, considerably faster than either of my children felt entirely comfortable with, though I dismissed their hesitation at the time as ordinary, understandable protectiveness rather than anything requiring serious concern. Susan, in particular, asked me gently, more than once during our courtship, whether I felt I was moving quickly, partly because of how much I'd missed feeling genuinely cared for during those 3 lonely years. A question I brushed aside at the time as unnecessary worry from a daughter who simply wanted her father to be careful, rather than the perceptive early warning it eventually turned out to represent. If you've ever had someone you loved slowly, subtly pull you away from the people who loved you first, this story is going to sit with you uncomfortably, because it certainly still sits that way with me. Hit that like button. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, because what my children eventually uncovered about Vivian's past changed everything I thought I understood about the woman I'd married. The changes, in retrospect, arrived gradually enough that I didn't fully register their cumulative weight until my children finally forced me to look at the pattern directly, laid out clearly, rather than experienced one small moment at a time. Vivian began, within the first year of our marriage, gently suggesting that Sunday dinners with Mark and Susan's families felt a bit much for a couple still building their own new traditions together, that perhaps alternating weeks or scaling back to monthly gatherings might allow us more space as a newly married couple to establish our own rhythm. I remember these suggestions arriving wrapped in language that sounded, on their surface, entirely reasonable, even loving. Frank, I just want us to have our own life together, too. Not just be absorbed entirely into your existing family patterns, she told me once. And at the time, I genuinely believed that sentiment, understanding it as the natural adjustment any blended family situation requires. She'd say things like this while curled against my shoulder on our porch swing in the evenings, her voice soft and reasonable. And I remember feeling, in those moments, genuinely grateful that my new wife wanted so badly to build something exclusively ours, rather than recognizing it as the first careful thread in a considerably larger pattern. Over the following 2 years, though, those monthly dinners gradually became quarterly, then became occasions requiring what felt like considerable advanced negotiation, and always, somehow, landing on dates that didn't quite work for Vivian's schedule, pushing them further out still. There was always a reasonable-sounding excuse, a prior commitment, a headache, a preference for a quieter weekend, each individually unremarkable, but accumulating, across 2 years, into a genuine and significant reduction in how often I actually saw my own grandchildren grow up during that period. Mark and Susan, for their part, began mentioning, carefully, gently, that they missed seeing me as often as they used to. Comments I initially waved away as ordinary family adjustment, rather than anything requiring closer examination. I remember Susan saying, during one particularly telling conversation over the phone, "Dad, it feels like every time we try to schedule something, there's some reason it needs to move. I'm not trying to create tension, I just miss you." I told her, at the time, that marriage requires compromise and adjustment for everyone involved, genuinely believing my own explanation even as I said it, not yet recognizing the particular one-sidedness of exactly whose schedule and preferences seemed to require accommodation in nearly every instance. Looking back now, I can identify a specific pattern in how these conversations with Vivian typically unfolded. she never once said directly, "I don't want you seeing your children." Instead, she would express some reasonable-sounding concern about the drive being tiring for me, about wanting quality time rather than obligatory gatherings, about her own social calendar needing consideration too. Each individual concern legitimate enough on its own terms that objecting to it would have felt petty or unreasonable in the moment, even as the cumulative pattern gradually, steadily reduced my actual contact with the family I'd spent decades building. The financial changes arrived more gradually still, and considerably more consequentially than the social distancing ever did. Roughly 18 months into our marriage, Vivian introduced me to a financial advisor named Curtis Wexler, someone she said had helped her considerably with her own late husband's estate planning, suggesting that given my age and my substantial business assets, it made sense to have a comprehensive review of my own estate documents, updating what she gently characterized as outdated planning from before Ruth's passing that no longer properly reflected my current life circumstances. Curtis presented himself during our first meeting at his office in a well-appointed downtown Cleveland building as precisely the kind of polished, reassuring professional you'd want handling something as significant as estate planning. A warm handshake, an office decorated with photographs of himself at various charity golf tournaments, a manner that combined genuine seeming warmth with the particular confident competence that makes complicated financial matters feel manageable rather than overwhelming to someone without specialized expertise in that area. Frank, at your stage of life, with the business assets you've built, it's genuinely irresponsible not to have a comprehensive asset protection strategy in place, Curtis told me during that first meeting, Vivian sitting beside me, nodding along with visible enthusiasm. Estate laws have changed considerably since whatever planning you did with your late wife years ago. I want to make sure everything you've built is properly protected, both from unnecessary tax burden and from potential liability exposure through the business itself. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters to understanding how this entire situation was able to unfold as thoroughly as it did. I trusted Vivian completely during this period, and I genuinely believed, at the time, that updating my estate planning to reflect my current marriage was simply responsible. Ordinary financial housekeeping, the kind of thing any reasonable person would do after remarrying later in life. I met with Curtis Wexler perhaps 6 or 7 times over the following year, signing various documents he presented to me, documents he described, each time, in fairly technical language about tax efficiency and asset protection structures, that I'll admit, honestly, I didn't always fully understand in their specific details, trusting instead that Vivian's recommendation of this advisor meant the work itself was trustworthy. Each individual meeting followed a similar comfortable rhythm, Curtis walking me through a stack of documents with genuine-sounding explanations about liability shields and tax-advantaged trust structures. Vivian present throughout each session, offering supportive, encouraging comments that reinforced Curtis's recommendations without ever seeming to push too hard herself. A careful division of roles I didn't recognize as deliberate until considerably later, once my children had helped me examine the pattern with clearer eyes than I'd been able to bring to it while the meetings were actually happening. It was Mark, ultimately, who first noticed something troubling enough to warrant closer examination, discovering, during routine business accounting work at the hardware store, that certain commercial real estate holdings connected to our original store location had been quietly retitled into a trust structure he didn't recognize, one that listed Vivian as primary beneficiary and, more troublingly, as the trust's controlling trustee upon any incapacitation or death on my part, arrangements that would have given her, in practical terms, immediate and complete control over decisions Mark had always assumed would eventually pass to him and Susan, according to the estate plan Ruth and I had established together decades earlier. Mark told me later that he'd nearly dismissed the discovery entirely, assuming initially it was simply an administrative filing error or some routine paperwork he didn't fully understand, until he'd pulled the actual recorded deed at the county recorder's office and confirmed, definitively, that the property transfer had been executed with my own notarized signature. Dated 8 months earlier, a transaction he had absolutely no memory of me ever mentioning to him, despite the property in question being directly connected to daily store operations he managed. Mark called Susan immediately upon discovering this, and the two of them, I learned only much later, spent several weeks quietly researching before ever raising the subject with me directly, wary of creating unnecessary conflict with Vivian if their concerns turned out to have some reasonable explanation they simply hadn't yet understood. Susan told me afterward that those weeks had been genuinely agonizing for both of them, torn between wanting to protect me from what might be nothing more than an innocent misunderstanding and a growing, uncomfortable certainty that something considerably more serious was actually underway. "Dad, we need to talk to you about something serious," Susan finally told me, during a lunch she'd arranged specifically for the two of us, without Vivian present, at a diner we'd frequented together since her own childhood, a request that itself, in retrospect, should have signaled to me that whatever she wanted to discuss carried more weight than an ordinary family conversation. I remember her hands were slightly unsteady around her coffee cup as she began explaining what Mark had discovered, and I could tell, watching her, that she'd rehearsed this conversation carefully, wanting to present the information in a way that felt supportive rather than accusatory. "Mark found some paperwork at the store that concerns us both," she continued. "We wanted to understand it fully before bringing it to you, because we didn't want to alarm you unnecessarily if there was a simple explanation we were missing. But Dad, the more we looked into it, the more concerned we both became." I listened that afternoon as Susan explained what Mark had discovered: the trust structure, Vivian's role as controlling trustee, the timeline suggesting these changes had been implemented gradually over the preceding 18 months without my full, clear understanding of their actual implications. She walked me through the specific property transfer Mark had found, the dates, the notarization, careful to present the factual details clearly without editorializing excessively about what those details might suggest about Vivian's intentions, a restraint I came to appreciate considerably more once I'd had time to reflect on how easily this conversation could have instead devolved into an accusatory confrontation that might have simply made me defensive rather than genuinely curious. I want to be honest about my initial reaction because I think it matters to understanding how difficult this entire process actually was for everyone involved. My first instinct was defensive, not toward my children exactly, but toward Vivian, a reflexive loyalty that made me want to explain away what Susan was describing as some kind of misunderstanding rather than genuine cause for concern. "Susan, I signed those documents myself," I told her, feeling a genuine need to defend both my own judgment and my wife's character simultaneously. "Curtis walked me through everything. I understand you and Mark are worried, but I don't think this is quite as concerning as you're describing it." "Dad, do you actually remember the specific language in those documents?" Susan asked me gently, setting down her fork entirely giving the question her full attention. Or do you remember Curtis's general explanation of what they were supposed to accomplish? Because those are two very different things, and Mark found language in there that goes considerably beyond simple tax planning. I sat with that question for a long moment, and I want to be honest that the answer, once I actually forced myself to examine it clearly, troubled me more than I initially wanted to admit. I remembered Curtis's warm, reassuring explanations during each of our meetings, remembered signing where he indicated I should sign, but I genuinely could not recall, with any real specificity, the actual detailed language of what I'd agreed to across those various documents. I tried, sitting in that familiar diner booth, to reconstruct even a single specific sentence from any of those signing sessions, and found I genuinely could not do it, retaining only Curtis's general reassuring tone rather than any concrete substance of what had actually been transferred or restructured. I need to look at this more carefully, I finally told Susan, with someone who isn't Curtis Wexler reviewing it for me this time. I decided, that same week, to review the actual paperwork myself, carefully, this time with my longtime family attorney, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, who had handled Ruth's and my estate planning decades earlier, and who I trusted implicitly, having worked with her through some of the most difficult decisions of my life, including the final arrangements during Ruth's illness. I called her office the following morning, and she cleared her schedule to see me that same afternoon, sensing, I think, from the tone of my voice on the phone, that whatever I needed to discuss carried genuine urgency. Patricia's office looked exactly as I remembered it from years earlier. The same worn leather chairs, the same framed diploma from Case Western that had hung on her wall since before Ruth's diagnosis. And I found something oddly comforting in that consistency, sitting down across from her with the folder of documents Mark had helped me assemble from the hardware store's files. She spent nearly 2 hours that first afternoon simply reading through everything silently, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, her expression growing progressively more serious as she worked through page after page of Curtis Wexler's carefully constructed documentation. I remember watching her face during that silence, trying to read her reaction before she was ready to share it. The particular anxiety of waiting for a diagnosis you already suspect will be difficult. Patricia's assessment, once she'd reviewed the full set of documents Curtis Wexler had prepared over the preceding year and a half, confirmed considerably more than I'd allowed myself to fear before that meeting. "Frank," she told me, sitting across her familiar desk, the same desk where she'd helped me and Ruth plan for our children's futures decades earlier. "These documents restructure your business real estate holdings into an irrevocable trust that names Vivian as sole trustee and primary beneficiary. In the event of your incapacitation or death, with Mark and Susan receiving only a modest, fixed distribution, considerably smaller than what your existing estate plan with Ruth had originally established for them. This isn't standard tax planning, Frank. This is a fundamental restructuring of your entire estate, executed gradually, document by document, in a way that would have been considerably harder for you to notice than if it had been presented as a single, comprehensive change." "Walk me through exactly what each document actually does," I asked her, in plain language, not the way Curtis originally explained it to me. Patricia nodded and pulled out the first document, laying it flat on the desk between us. "This first one, from your initial meeting 18 months ago, established the trust itself, a seemingly innocuous administrative step that most people wouldn't think twice about, since it doesn't transfer any actual assets on its own. This second document, from 3 months later, transferred the deed to your original store's commercial property into that trust. This third one, from 6 months after that, added a provision naming Vivian as sole trustee rather than a co-trustee arrangement, which would have at least required her to coordinate decisions with someone else, perhaps yourself, or an independent professional trustee. And this final document, signed just 4 months ago, added the specific beneficiary language limiting Mark and Susan's distribution to a fixed amount considerably below the property's actual current market value, while granting Vivian discretionary control over everything beyond that fixed amount. I sat in that office feeling something I can only describe as a very particular kind of vertigo. The specific disorientation of discovering the trust you'd extended completely, without reservation, had potentially been used against you in ways you hadn't been equipped to recognize while it was actually happening. Patricia, how does someone structure something like this without the client fully understanding what they're agreeing to at each step? Frank, I've seen this pattern before, more times than I'd like to admit over 30 years of practice, Patricia said, her voice carrying a weariness that told me this wasn't an abstract, professional observation, but something she'd witnessed cause real harm to real families previously. It typically works exactly the way you've described it happening to you. A series of individually reasonable-sounding steps, each one explained in isolation with genuine seeming justification, spread out over enough time that the client never sees the complete, cumulative picture until someone forces them to look at all the documents together at once, the way we're doing right now. Is there any explanation for this that isn't as concerning as it currently sounds? I asked her, genuinely hoping, even at that point, for some version of events that didn't require me to fully confront what my children had discovered. Patricia was quiet for a moment before answering, choosing her words with obvious care. Frank, I've known you a long time, and I don't think you're a foolish man. But I do think Curtis Wexler's documentation, combined with the pattern of gradual implementation over 18 months, suggests a deliberate strategy rather than routine estate planning. I can't tell you with certainty what Vivian's specific intentions are, but I can tell you, with professional confidence, that these documents do not serve your children's interests the way your original estate plan did, and that the manner in which they were implemented raises legitimate questions worth taking seriously. What would it take to reverse this? I asked her, assuming I decide that's genuinely necessary. Given that these documents were signed relatively recently, and that we can demonstrate a pattern of gradual, piecemeal disclosure rather than comprehensive upfront explanation, I believe we have a reasonably strong basis to challenge the trust's validity, particularly the irrevocable provisions, Patricia said. I'd want to move carefully and methodically, though, documenting everything clearly before we take any formal action, to ensure whatever we do holds up completely if it's ever challenged. I want to describe what happened over the following weeks because I think it matters to understanding how carefully I ultimately approached this situation, rather than reacting immediately out of anger or wounded pride. I asked Mark to help me quietly, using resources available through the hardware store's own business insurance provider, which included access to a private investigation service for legitimate business due diligence purposes, to look into Curtis Wexler's professional history, and separately into Vivian's own background, more thoroughly than I'd ever thought to examine during our initial whirlwind courtship. Mark connected us with an investigator named Susan Choi, no relation to my own Susan, who specialized in exactly this kind of background research, and I remember sitting with Mark in his small office at the back of the flagship store, both of us reviewing her preliminary findings together on his computer screen, feeling a particular strange discomfort at investigating my own wife's history. This thoroughly, even while understanding clearly why it had become necessary. What Mark's research uncovered over the following month troubled me considerably more than even Patricia's initial assessment had prepared me for. Vivian Cross, it turned out, had been married twice before our own marriage. Not once, as she'd originally told me. Both marriages to considerably older, financially successful widowers. Both marriages ending under circumstances that, examined together, suggested a pattern I hadn't allowed myself to consider seriously until confronted with the documented evidence directly. Her first previous marriage, to a man named Harold Bittman, a retired manufacturing executive in Columbus, had ended in divorce after just under 3 years. Court filings revealing a dispute over exactly the kind of trust restructuring I'd just discovered in my own estate documents. Bittman's adult children having successfully challenged and reversed similar arrangements before the marriage's dissolution. Susan Choi obtained the actual divorce filing from Franklin County court records, and reading through it that evening at my kitchen table, I found the language describing Bittman's situation almost eerily similar to my own circumstances. The same gradual document restructuring, the same reliance on a financial advisor recommended by Vivian herself, though the advisor named in that earlier case was actually a different individual than Curtis Wexler, suggesting Vivian's pattern involved cycling through different professional collaborators across her various marriages rather than relying on any single fixed accomplice. Her second marriage, to a man named Walter Higgins, a retired dentist in Toledo, had ended with Higgins's death 18 months into the marriage, a death attributed to natural causes, according to available records, though the timeline, examined alongside everything else Mark had uncovered, left me with a considerable unease I couldn't easily dismiss, even without any concrete evidence suggesting anything beyond genuine coincidence. Susan Choi was careful, in her report, to note explicitly that nothing in the publicly available records suggested any wrongdoing connected to Higgins's death specifically, simply that the estate distribution following his passing had heavily favored Vivian over Higgins's own adult children, a pattern consistent with what appeared to be occurring in my own situation, regardless of the entirely separate and unrelated question of how Higgins actually died. I remember sitting with that particular piece of information for a long time, feeling a genuine internal struggle about how much weight to give it. I didn't want to entertain unfounded suspicions about something as serious as another person's death without concrete evidence supporting anything beyond coincidence. And I made a deliberate choice, discussing it with Mark and Susan both, to treat that detail as troubling context rather than as evidence of anything beyond the financial pattern itself, which was, on its own, already more than sufficient to warrant serious concern about my own situation. Curtis Wexler, similarly, turned out to have a documented history of professional complaints filed with the Ohio Department of Insurance and financial institutions. 3 separate complaints over the preceding decade, each involving elderly clients whose estate plans had been substantially restructured in ways that favored a newer spouse over adult children from a previous marriage. Complaints that had each been resolved through private settlements rather than any formal regulatory action, but that nonetheless established a professional pattern considerably more troubling than an isolated instance of aggressive but legitimate financial advice. Mark obtained copies of these complaint filings through a public records request, and reading through them together one evening, we both noted how closely the language used by previous complainants echoed exactly the pattern we'd identified in my own documents. The same gradual implementation, the same technical language obscuring the actual cumulative effect of what was being signed. "Dad, I think we need to understand something clearly before we go any further," Mark told me during one of these evening review sessions at his kitchen table, his own children already asleep upstairs. "This isn't necessarily about proving Vivian is some kind of calculated predator who set out from day one to target you specifically. It might be that, or it might be something more complicated. Someone who genuinely cares about you in some real way, but who has also, across multiple marriages, developed patterns and relationships, like this connection to Curtis, that serve her financial interests regardless of her deeper feelings. Either way, the practical effect on our family is the same, and I think that's what actually matters most right now." I found Mark's framing genuinely helpful in that moment, giving me permission to move forward with protecting my own estate and my children's inheritance without needing to first resolve, with complete certainty, exactly how calculated or genuine Vivian's underlying feelings toward me actually were, a question I suspected I might never fully answer with confidence, regardless of how much additional investigation we pursued. I sat with this information for several difficult days before deciding how I wanted to proceed, feeling a particular grief that had nothing to do with anger exactly, but something closer to mourning, the specific loss of believing completely in a love I'd genuinely thought was rebuilding my life after Ruth's death, rather than quietly dismantling the foundation I'd spent 4 decades building for my children. I arranged to meet with Vivian directly, at home, on an evening when I knew we'd have privacy for an extended, difficult conversation, bringing with me the full documentation Patricia and Mark had helped assemble, the original trust paperwork, alongside the research into her previous marriages and Curtis Wexler's professional history. I remember sitting in our living room that afternoon, before she arrived home from an errand, arranging the folder on the coffee table, rehearsing in my mind how I wanted to open this conversation, wanting to be direct without being accusatory, giving her genuine opportunity to explain herself before I drew any final conclusions. "Vivian, I need to talk to you about something serious," I told her, once we'd settled at our kitchen table. The same table where she'd first suggested reducing our family dinner frequency years earlier, though I hadn't fully registered the significance of that particular room at the time. I watched her face carefully as I began laying out what I'd discovered, starting with the trust documents themselves before moving into the broader pattern Mark's research had revealed. I placed the property deed on the table first, watching her expression as I explained the timeline Patricia had walked me through. Vivian's initial reaction was denial, insisting the trust structure Curtis had recommended was simply sound financial planning that I'd fully understood and agreed to at the time, that any similarities to her previous marriages reflected nothing more than coincidence, and the ordinary financial planning any wealthy older man's advisor might reasonably recommend. "Frank, I love you," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion that even in that moment I found myself struggling to fully disbelieve. "I don't understand why you're suddenly treating our marriage like some kind of criminal investigation. Whatever Mark found, I promise you there's a reasonable explanation. Vivian, I have court records from your divorce from Harold Bittman describing almost identical trust language to what Curtis prepared for us," I told her, watching her face carefully as I said it, sliding the divorce filing across the table toward her. "I have 3 separate professional complaints against Curtis Wexler, each one involving an older client and a newer spouse restructuring an estate against the interests of adult children from a previous marriage. I need you to help me understand how all of this fits together as coincidence, because right now, I'm struggling considerably to see it that way. Vivian stared at the documents for a long moment without touching them, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, the particular recalculation of a person realizing that her usual explanations weren't going to sufficiently address the specific evidence now sitting between us. "You investigated me," she finally said, her voice carrying something closer to genuine hurt than defensiveness for the first time in the conversation. "Frank, I understand you're upset about the trust language, but having me investigated like a criminal, that feels like a betrayal of its own kind." "I understand why it feels that way to you," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, despite my own genuine emotional turmoil in that moment. "But Vivian, I discovered a property transfer with my own signature on a deed I have no memory of clearly understanding at the time I signed it, connected to a business my children have spent their entire adult lives helping me build. I think, given those circumstances, some degree of investigation was not just reasonable, but necessary." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 3 hours, moving through denial, then anger, then something that eventually resembled a more genuine, difficult honesty than anything Vivian had offered me throughout our entire marriage. She acknowledged eventually that Curtis had indeed handled her previous husband's estate planning as well, that she'd recommended him to me specifically because she trusted his particular expertise in exactly this kind of situation, though she continued insisting, even as the conversation wound toward its difficult conclusion, that her intentions toward me had always been genuine, whatever pattern the paperwork itself might suggest to an outside observer. At one point, well into the second hour, Vivian said something that I've thought about often since, sitting with her head in her hands at our kitchen table. "Frank, I don't know how to explain this in a way that makes it sound less bad than it probably sounds right now. After Walter died, and after everything with Harold before that, Curtis reached out to me, said he understood exactly the kind of financial security a woman in my position needs to think about, remarrying later in life without her own independent wealth. I let him guide me toward exactly the same solutions each time, because they worked, because they gave me security I was terrified of losing again. I don't think I ever sat down and consciously decided to hurt your children, Frank. But I also can't honestly tell you I examined closely enough whether what Curtis was recommending actually served you fairly, because examining that too closely might have meant giving up a solution that had protected me twice before. I want to be honest about where I ultimately landed on the question of Vivian's actual intentions, because I think false certainty in either direction would be dishonest. I don't know, with complete confidence, whether Vivian set out deliberately to manipulate a vulnerable, grieving widower out of his estate, following some established playbook refined across multiple previous marriages, or whether she genuinely loved me, while also, perhaps not entirely consciously, gravitating toward familiar patterns and familiar financial advisors that had served her interests in the past without her fully examining the implications for my own children. What I do know with complete certainty is that the practical effect of those patterns, regardless of her precise internal motivations, would have substantially and unfairly deprived Mark and Susan of the inheritance Ruth and I had always intended for them. I worked with Patricia over the following month, to formally revoke the trust structure Curtis Wexler had established, restoring my original estate plan, naming Mark and Susan as the primary beneficiaries of my business assets, with appropriate provisions ensuring Vivian's own reasonable financial security through a separate, clearly defined arrangement that reflected genuine fairness without granting her the controlling influence over decisions that should properly belong to my own children. Patricia structured this new arrangement carefully, providing Vivian with a modest but genuinely fair settlement reflecting the actual length and nature of our marriage, without the sweeping control the original trust had granted her over assets that had taken Ruth and me 4 decades to build. I also, at Patricia's recommendation, filed a formal complaint against Curtis Wexler with the Ohio Department of Insurance and Financial Institutions, adding my own documented experience to the 3 prior complaints already on file against him, providing regulators with a 4th, considerably well-documented instance of exactly the pattern they'd apparently been unable to fully substantiate through the earlier individually settled complaints. Patricia told me, several months later, that my complaint, combined with the accumulated weight of the prior 3, had ultimately triggered a more formal regulatory review of Curtis's practice, though the final outcome of that review remained pending as of the last update I'd received. Vivian and I separated shortly after that difficult conversation at our kitchen table, and I want to be honest that even now, months later, I carry a complicated grief about the end of that marriage, missing, genuinely, certain aspects of the companionship and warmth she'd brought into my life during a period of profound loneliness, even while understanding clearly why the marriage couldn't continue once I'd seen its underlying pattern so plainly. She moved out over the following 2 weeks, and I remember the particular strangeness of watching her pack the same belongings she'd brought into our home 4 years earlier, feeling simultaneously relieved and genuinely sad. 2 emotions I hadn't expected to experience so completely simultaneously. Mark and Susan, for their part, handled the entire situation with a grace and restraint I'm genuinely proud of, never once saying, "We told you so," despite their initial reservations about the marriage's speed having been entirely vindicated by everything that eventually surfaced. Mark, in particular, worked carefully alongside Patricia to ensure the hardware store's business structure was fully protected going forward, establishing clearer safeguards against any future situation where a spouse might gain this kind of unilateral control over decisions affecting the family business without adequate transparency to everyone involved, including a provision requiring any future estate planning changes affecting the business to be reviewed jointly with both Mark and an independent attorney before finalization, a safeguard I readily agreed to, given everything we'd all just experienced together. Susan, meanwhile, has made a point of scheduling our family dinners with a regularity that feels, to me, like a quiet, deliberate act of reclaiming something that had been slowly eroded over the preceding years, without my fully realizing how much I'd lost until it began returning. We now gather most Sundays again, much as we did before Vivian entered my life, and I've noticed myself appreciating those gatherings with a particular intensity I don't think I fully possessed even before this entire ordeal began. The specific gratitude that comes from nearly losing something important, and then, consciously, deliberately, choosing to protect it going forward. I think often, these days, about how easily this entire situation might have continued unchecked if Mark hadn't happened to notice that initial paperwork irregularity during routine business accounting, if my children had simply accepted my defensive reassurance during that first difficult lunch conversation rather than pursuing their concerns with such careful, patient thoroughness. I have come to believe that Mark and Susan's willingness to investigate quietly, methodically, and to approach me with genuine care rather than accusation made all the difference in how this situation was ultimately able to resolve, protecting both my relationship with my children and, eventually, my own clear-eyed understanding of what had actually been happening in my marriage. I've also thought considerably about my own role in allowing this situation to develop as thoroughly as it did. The particular vulnerability that profound loneliness creates in a person, making genuine warmth and attention feel so precious that we sometimes stop asking the careful questions we might otherwise ask as a matter of course. I don't think that vulnerability makes me foolish, exactly, but I do think it made me considerably less careful than I might otherwise have been about a decision, remarriage, that ultimately affected far more than just my own personal happiness. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I'll see you in the next one. The thumbnail. Text: my new wife convinced me to sign tax planning documents that actually cut my children out of everything. My son noticed something wrong at the family business. What we discovered about her past changed everything. E-mini description. A widower remarries 4 years after losing his wife, gradually signing estate documents his new wife's financial advisor recommends as routine tax planning. When his son notices something troubling in the family business paperwork, a careful investigation reveals a documented pattern spanning 2 previous marriages and a difficult, honest reckoning about who his new wife actually is. F lessons from this story. Estate document changes framed as routine or just tax planning deserve independent review, especially when implemented gradually across multiple separate signings rather than all at once. A pattern across someone's past relationships, viewed together rather than individually, can reveal something no single incident would show on its own. Approaching a parent with concerns about a new spouse works far better through careful, patient evidence than through accusation or ultimatums. Loving someone completely doesn't require abandoning healthy skepticism about financial advice they introduce you to, however trustworthy it initially seems. Protecting your children's inheritance and processing complicated grief about a failed relationship can happen at the same time. One doesn't require you to fully resolve the other first.